I'm Mark Adler, writer, director, producer.
Hi, this is Jason Maurer, co-director and writer on the movie Delgo.
And I'm Warren Grubb, animation director and VFX supervisor.
Well, guys, I guess I'll start us off since the Farfillian Super is on the screen. Farfillian is a derivative of my mother's maiden name, Farfel, which also happens to be my middle name. The name of the title and the protagonist, Delgo, actually come from a baby naming book where we amended the name Delgado since we felt it would be best to have a two-syllable name. It also happens to be a settlement in the northern province of Sudan and the site of an important Nubian temple. Since Delgo's civilization drew on several tribal influences, which mimic some of those found in Africa and Egypt, the name seemed to be an ideal fit. Our concept for the movie was to create a timeless but still engaging story to impart wisdom and moral virtues for all ages. The story that we chose to tell was about acceptance and cultural unity, more specifically racial harmony. And as a backdrop for our tale, we chose this magical fantasy world replete with all the requisite elements of an epic: love, war, and tragedy.
This entire first shot was all done by one animator, and while we wanted to make sure that the creatures were always alive and entertaining, we also wanted to make sure we didn't take away too much from the names of the voice talent. This whole first sequence used to be a lot longer. It had Burt Reynolds as Delgo's dad. We cut it down a lot just to make the story flow better and get you into it quicker, but we just wanted really to establish the world and the relationship that Delgo had with his dad and show him as a cute little boy.
It kind of gets a little darker, and we start to see this antagonism coming with the Norin. Their land dying, falling apart.
You can see here the importance of a lot of the more subtle effects, like the blowing leaves, carrying cross shots, and the dead grass, and the wings causing the clouds to trace after the flight path, all just giving it that extra level of detail. This form dissolve was a lot more challenging than I expected because it's so exact. We actually ended up taking the animation from one shot and bringing it into the other just so the hands would line up pixel for pixel.
My little princess will grow up to rule our people in a land of beauty.
Here's a shot that's really an homage to the flying monkeys from The Wizard of Oz.
This was a combination of just 3D elements rendered with natural lighting and a lot of matte paintings and effects to show that transition of how the society changed over time.
Well, as if making a full-length feature, particularly in our case an animated feature, isn't difficult enough, epic films usually require a seemingly epic scale of the production team. Now, not only were we a relatively small team, but we were also first-time filmmakers, so as you might imagine, we had quite a challenge on our hands. But with the passion and commitment from this very dedicated team, and a philosophy that a goal is just a dream with a deadline, we did absolutely everything within our power to make Delgo a reality, a process that took us over a decade.
I love this expansive body in the background with the sunset. It almost makes this scene look romantic.
This was actually one of the first recording sessions I directed. A group of us flew to New York, then we drove to a small studio in the Hamptons. I had 102-degree fever with the Academy Award-winning Miss Bancroft in the recording booth and her legendary husband, Mel Brooks, on the sofa behind me. It was quite a stressful moment, but despite some of the initial consternation, I think it turned out great.
Every shot we had with the king had to have cloth solving for that flap on the front and the tails on the back of his coat. This scene was one of the most challenging in terms of the story we're trying to tell, because it's such a heavy point of the story, and we just had to make sure that it didn't come off as too violent or disturbing. With that in mind, we went with a more gaseous, wispy look to the effects so that it could look more like she was being put under a spell rather than actually killing her. This sequence with the judgment is really one of the bleakest of the entire film, so you'll notice the palette is almost entirely gray and very dreary.
Although we debated a lot early in story about Sidessa's wings and this idea of cutting off Sidessa's wings. what's fitting punishment for murder for a Noran, and this idea of flight equaling freedom and all that it entails. And we really wanted to find a way to isolate her and kind of put her away and lock her away and take the one thing that she cherished above all things, which was the wings.
Then in this scene, we come in and we immediately see that she does have wings, but Chris was able to modify this rig so that she could take the wings off mid-scene. And then you, of course, see that she has this almost comically tragic wing wall of all these artificial wings that she uses to try to replace the ones that were taken from her.
The abundance of prosthetic wings also demonstrates Sidessa's vanity.
This was a little tribute to any film that has one of those funny eating scenes in it, so we just went to town with whatever we thought was funny, and the animator just pretty much ran with it.
When we did the staging actually for this with live actors. A group from the Whole World Theater came in, and actually, it was the high school group. Actually, we did this one with, and then later it developed it more with the Whole World Theater troupe. But we actually had them walk around a table and planned it out and had them doing these things, just so I could experiment a little bit with the staging of Sidessa and what she would be doing. But I wanted this kind of circling nature in her, this like shark circling her prey before the kill. It's still light and playful, but kind of deadly all at the same time, where the prey doesn't really understand what's going to happen to them. They sort of have an idea, but not quite. And to me, that was really, really important.
So modest about your accomplishments. The tribe stands solidly behind.
Unfortunately, Miss Bancroft passed away before recording some of the lines in this scene, as well as a few others. And as you might imagine, it was incredibly difficult to find an actress who could double both the acting and the distinctive voice of an Academy Award-winning actress in her 70s. We literally auditioned dozens of people, and as we almost exhausted all of our options, this very talented local actress here in Atlanta, who was already voicing Miss Sutley and Piero in the film, asked if she could give it a try. Interestingly, she requested to see the videotapes of Miss Bancroft's recording rather than just hear her lines. A few days later, she auditioned, and while reciting the lines, she clamped on her neck and pointed her nose towards the ceiling. The voice sounded so similar, it didn't even require any post-modulation.
Pleading for mercy. Some music should cover it up.
These brute creatures were actually all voiced by one person for this scene, and it was amusing because the person was actually of a pretty small stature and had even done commercial work voicing elves, so he was almost a elven-looking person himself, but he was able to give some of the deepest, richest voices for the entire film.
All right, so here we got Delgo and Philo introducing them. What's interesting about this is on the version I believe you're watching, this wasn't actually the introductory scene for Delgo. The market scene was actually the introductory scene for Delgo, but for theater release, we cut it down to shorten the film and kind of speed up the pacing a little bit. So it's really interesting, and this was actually a perfect transition for bringing in his character and Philo, just to show the playful banter between the two of them.
A lot of these shots were actually animated in place just because it was easier for the animators, and then we would slide the backgrounds behind them so it actually looked like they were moving. This being an extreme example.
Each primary character had their own musical theme, which can be heard with variation throughout the film. This is our hero's theme. Jeff describes the concepts behind much of this in the Sounds of Delgo track on the DVD, and I'd encourage you to watch it if you're interested in hearing more about the music and sound design for the film.
So love this kind of track up here. I wish I could have done a lot more of these kind of camera moves on the film, but we just didn't have the render budget for it. We really had to make sure that we designed the camera work to maximize. See here, these are all static. To try to maximize my framing and my composition for storytelling without doing subtle moves.
These crowd sequences were interesting because when the animator starts out, of course, they just really have a couple of the primary rock biters that they're working with, and all that crowd and dust and environment is added at a later date. On top of that, they have all these technical challenges of having to animate a character on the back of one creature and then leaping from one creature onto another and locking onto that creature and then following that new creature's secondary motion. So some of these scenes where they jump from creature to creature become this mix of technical prowess from the animator and then of course the traditional animation skills that they have to have.
Let's talk about Philo for a second, and his role, as being kind of like the comic relief. That slingshot you see right there, that actually was originally designed for Delgo. I actually even think that the text on the side says Delgo is his name, but we wanted to kind of change it up. And early in story, Philo needed some kind of weapon, and Delgo had his axe, and Philo needed something that wasn't too violent, but he could play with and make mistakes with. And so we went for this kind of the goofy 6-year-old or 8-year-old slingshot. And Philo went through several revisions. He used to have this bonnet style hat, and it made him look like a girl. And so we had Mark change it and shift it around, and it ended up actually working really nice as a good prop because we can move it around and throw it.
We tried a lot of different arm positions for these shots where Delgo is hanging onto a branch because while it takes a lot of work to hold your body up, we wanted him to look really just relaxed and calm.
The poor Gep. This is a running gag through the whole film. Every time Philo does something stupid like that, the Gep somehow gets harmed or endangered. So by the end of the film, I think there's like 3 or 4 instances in the film. So like by the end of the film, the Gep is they attack him or whatever, and we do a closing shot with the Gep, which is really, really kind of nice.
This is a cute bit with Philo's dialogue. It was one of the scenes where Chris Kattan really put his personal stamp on the character. He improvised the lines here and had so many funny bits, it was hard to choose which one to use. One of my favorite scenes that demonstrate his improvisational ability was cut, but you can see it on this DVD in the deleted scenes track. I think it's called Philo Nonsense.
We originally had Kyla introduced in an earlier scene, but that was cut for time constraints, and this ended up being a great place to introduce her anyways because she has to introduce herself to Delgo, and it also sets up this immediate racial tension between them and a place to see Delgo's pride and how it gets him in trouble. And then it leads to seeing how Kyla has this inner strength and what appears to be a moral strength above Delgo, so you can see how she's going to be able to help him in the future.
So let's talk about names for a second. The name Bogardus was actually derived by concatenating Bo plus guard plus us. It was one of the few names that didn't actually change from the original script. Some were revised since the names were too common, so Zandra would become Kyla and King Fawn became King Zan. Others like Sedessa were amended from Sorella, since Sorella was too analogous to Cruella de Vil from 101 Dalmatians. There was actually a lot of thought that went into every name. We did some research and determined for maximum audience recall, it was best to have every character's name start with a different first letter and or sound. In some cases, we even needed to go a step further. In fact, when testing the original names of the two societies, the Lochni and the Nori, most people confuse the two. So we added an N to the end of the word Nori, creating Lochni and Norin, and this confusion was eliminated.
Why is that tree on fire?
Coming into this scene, you can immediately see the difference in lifestyle between Kyla and Delgo. She's sitting at this tea table with her father, the king. So it gives you that two different places they're coming from. But then you can see this generational difference between her and her father, where she's more open to trying to forget the problems of the past and get along with these other people, whereas her father, as good as his intentions may be, is more locked in the past and needs to grow if these problems are going to be resolved.
I thought this was a nice touch to have the king turn to a painting of his family while Kyla's mother, the queen, was still alive. It's the quintessential example of a picture being worth 1,000 words. Here in a quick beat, you can literally feel how the king laments the loss of his wife and wonders how life would be different for Kyla if she had grown up with her around.
Guide the the stones. The staff will follow.
A lot of times during production, you'd end up in situations where things just weren't playing well when you showed them to audiences, and we added this overhead shot just because it just wasn't really clear how this thing was traveling, how far it was traveling and such.
By the way, except for the sound, this film was created nowhere near Hollywood. Most of the production was done in Atlanta. That's Georgia, for those of you who don't know. And most people don't realize it, but Georgia isn't just about peaches and peanuts. This state has a rich history in cinema, from Gone with the Wind and Driving Miss Daisy to Fried Green Tomatoes, The Legend of Bagger Vance, Forrest Gump. The list goes on and on. And there's many notable filmmakers who have roots here in Georgia. Tyler Perry, Spike Lee, Julia Roberts, Steven Soderbergh, Holly Hunter, Burt Reynolds. I'm sure there are countless others as well. Thanks to the state's generous tax incentives, the incredibly talented Georgia labor pool, and the existing resource infrastructure here, we were aided in our ability to realize our celluloid dreams.
This scene is, Delgo's the mystical lesson scene where he's, hand in the heart and one, where he's really supposed to be paying attention to this this inner voice and not reacting to anger. And I think a lot of people can relate to this idea, and it comes from some of it comes from my youth, some of it comes from Mark's youth, Scott's youth. We all we collaborated and discussed kind of how we wanted this to be manifested, and here we show a little bit of Delgo's memory. What's interesting is this whole scene in here actually used to be one solid scene throughout the whole film. We had like a whole section, and then Adler and I sat down one day, and I think in the edit we just kind of hacked it out, and we said, this is not working. We need to break it up, spread it around. And so we kind of reshifted the whole story, and we were already in production, and we were moving things. We moved the edit around and shifted it around, and it worked, and it came out nicely. And I think it gradually sets up Delgo's inner turmoil.
In terms of animation, we wanted to make sure that these stones were actually reacting to what Marley was saying and thinking. And additionally, we wanted to make sure that the Uberstone effect would look good once they were animated, because it was based on the physical movement of the actual stones. So you couldn't just arbitrarily do something. You had to do some tests and make sure that when we put the simulation on it, it still looked good. For most of the fire effects in the film, we would build presets when we were making the props, and then once we needed to use them, we would just scale those presets to what was appropriate for that scene. A lot of thought went into the actual gameplay on this particular sequence. Even though you don't see it, the art directors and directors got together during the script polishing so that there was that foundation of rules, so that when it was acted out, it didn't just look like a bunch of random stuff that was not connected. It had that foundation to make it feel more real.
I'll raise you.
With what?
This scene was always in question. This idea that Bogardus has a flaw, that one of the potential heroes is damaged, that he has a vice, which is gambling, and how he can overcome this. How he can overcome this problem, because we needed to get him in trouble. We needed somehow to get Bogardus into jail, so that Delgo could meet him and that they could eventually work together, so that Delgo could overcome his race, so they both could really overcome his racism, or their racism. And so here we use his gambling. We set up his gambling in this scene, I think, really nicely. Again, lots of static shots. So we're doing like a lot of medium and close-up shots, subtle shifts up and down, to reinforce dominance versus submissive behavior within the character structure here. All right, so here, those mountains you'll see right there with that was really influenced by the mountains of China. Mark and I had seen some images of them, and Mark Jackson and I had seen some images of them, and we were very impressed.
The initial concept for the prologue was a series of slowly moving frescoes accompanied by narration. We actually fully produced the entire prologue with this idea before we decided it wasn't really fast-paced enough and seemed a bit foreign to the rest of the film. So, since we had already created all the panels, we thought it would be a good idea to repurpose a few of them as wall paintings in the castle, since they gave us subtle insight into the tenets and history of the Norn people. You'll note the exchange here between the king and his advisors defines their personalities a bit. While somewhat uncharacteristic of Bogartis' hot-headed and impulsive nature, he's learned from the mistakes of his past, and he realizes that nobody really wins a war. But meanwhile, the traitors, Rice and Gelmore, are trying to push the king to take military action against the Lochni. So the scene ends with the king making a decision, which is contrary to most of his council's advice, although showing that he has a mind of his own.
Oh, this scene. I love this scene. Look at the blowing grass in this one. I really wanted kind of a Twilight feel on the rocks. This scene's really inspired, the shooting of this scene, because it's coming up, you're going to see the evil sark in the grass. It's called a sark. This shot in particular is inspired from the movie Ghost in the Darkness, this idea of lions hunting people. Really wanted to kind of create a little bit of tension here, a little bit of spook, so that Delgo has an opportunity to save her.
When doing the character design for Kyla, we wanted to stray away from the cliche archetype of the voluptuous female lead. Instead, we opted for a more natural figure that would be more relatable to little girls. We also gave her some spiffy facial paint to add a bit of intrigue to her character. These little creatures here, these bipeds, are called Squeep, S-Q-U-E-E-P.
A lot of the architecture and stuff is influenced heavily by an artist by the name of Roger Dean. You guys probably know him, well, those of you who were in the 80s know him from doing a lot of the Yes and the Asia covers. But it's this phenomenal kind of surrealist environment painter. Really, really great stuff. And so when we sat down to talk about the art direction with Mark and Zhang, I really said, hey, this guy, I really like this guy. Let's kind of play with this a little bit. And they definitely made it happen.
Believe it or not, it was actually quite challenging to place the plants in most of the outdoor scenes. Every time we laid out the vegetation, it appeared too landscaped and not natural. Even after studying a bit of horticulture, it seemed like we'd need a botanist to arrange and scale the plants, cluster them in a natural formation, and then taper them properly so they didn't feel pasted into the set. Maybe next time we'll just use more grass and less plants.
The wings on the Norrin, oh boy. I'll never forget the day that Jackson, because they used to be feathered wings. We were going to do like angelic wings, and they were just a pain, just way technically difficult. And Jackson pulled out this drawing of a Norrin with these grasshopper wings on it, and I'm like, that's it, that's totally it, we can do that.
Spig introduced some interesting challenges for animators because he was one of the more cartoony characters. So his motions were more snappy and exaggerated, and we have this realistic 3D world, but we still had to have these quick cartoony moves be believable. So they had to morph some of the traditional 2D animation skills with a more realistic motion that you have with the 3D environments.
I dare say, sir, I'm simply fortified by your appalling formality.
In the next shot, as we pan down, you may notice a profile of Sedessa in the stained glass. And on the floor here, and in many other places of the castle, there's also the symbol which appears under her right eye, an upside-down sickle. The image of an eye with the sickle under it was iconography intended to personify an inverted monarchy with Sedessa's omnipresent sense of being.
This series of shots was also really unusual because I was able to take one animator, Eileen, and give her all the shots. So it was like I was casting her in the role rather than what we usually have to do, which is break it up between a lot of different animators and have them work together. So here she was able to get a really good feeling for the scene. She wanted to do it. She knew what she wanted to do, and she was able to become those characters.
To me, that was quintessential Sedessa, and Ms. Bancroft's voice work there she nailed it. That was bam, right on the money.
1,000 Digans, that's all I need. You know I can't, General.
We had a lot of characters in the film who were wearing armor, both just in day-to-day motions and in more extreme cases like fighting. So we had to put a lot of thought and design into that on the back end. We used a lot of expressions, which are essentially just mathematical formulas that would articulate the armor as the character is moving so that the animator would have a lot of flexibility. And on top of that, if there were some more specialized actions that weren't your everyday thing, then the animator could grab a different layer of control and just move that particular piece of armor to facilitate that motion.
You don't have access, General? Or...
To segue to this next shot, I really wanted to transition from Bogey's eyes to coins on the table. The intent was to mimic Greek mythology, where coins are placed over the eyes of the deceased as a toll for the ferryman of the underworld river. I thought this would be a nice touch, since it accentuates the point of Rias essentially selling Bogey up the river.
We had a rather complex story, so there were a lot of places where we wanted to compress time just to get things moving along. So in this case, you can see as soon as Bogardus is sentenced, you cut straight to the prison where you see someone who was evidently a captive before, and then you come in and you see Bogardus is already in jail. In choreographing the moves for this fight sequence, we wanted to highlight how lightning quick and dominant Bogardus was, and then at the same time show that he was still really no match for Rias at this point of the film. This was one of the very first full sequences we did. We did it back when we joked around that this was going to be a silent film because it's just the nature of the production. We started off before we had all the voice talent locked down, so we were ready to start animating before we had final voices.
Our composer Jeff Zanelli did an amazing job with the music. The score needed to feel big and set the mood, but we also wanted a somewhat tribal edge. So Jeff chose a plethora of instrumentation from around the world that created this desired effect. Here, what may sound like clapping is actually this massive Japanese drum. However, instead of just hitting the drum, this sound is actually created by striking the wooden edge of the drum. And the cadence of the beats here is also quite nice as the tempo builds to the crescendo of the explosion. We come out of the explosion, and you can feel how the music alone alters the mood to a more somber circumstance.
Sometimes it's the really simple, slow scenes that are the most challenging for animation. Here, it's really all about not just the mechanics of this slow move while keeping it realistic, but also just the subtlety of trying to capture what's inside Delgo's head, because you don't have any vocalizations to work with, and you don't have really any other stimulus. You're just focused on him. So then when you see this big change of emotion, you can see the animation style change as well.
We need to begin today's lesson.
It's the Norn that need to be taught a lesson.
We really spent a lot of time thinking about the space, thinking about the world, wanting to know who these cultures were, what they were about, where they came from, how they were related, where they related, in some way. You'll notice, like, we took kind of a simian lizard style approach to their muzzles, which I'm sure Warren can comment on in terms of the difficulty to get expression out of.
If what you believe is honorable. A stone sage uses his powers to build.
You'll note how Delgo's anger has subsided as he's pacified by his mentor, and it seems like he's understanding the lesson to be learned from the desecration of their sanctuary. But his bigotry is so deep-seated that his tolerance lapses as he lashes out, now directing his anger at Marley, and Marley is of course disappointed in not being able to get through to Delgo.
The Norn won't stop until somebody stops them.
Ah, that big wing thing there, that's a Zuzu. Way back in the distance, that's a Sky Beast. Originally, the Sky Beasts were supposed to be these things that all of the Lockney lived on. They were these giant floating gas bags that just kind of got relegated back down to this giant flying creature.
A lot of these little comedy bits with Spig and Spog were basically scripted, but they had ad-libs from the animator. And in this sequence, we took this really long shot so you could do almost a more vaudevillian gag with a lot of complex staging. And some of these elements were just created on the fly. We basically knew what needed to happen, but the animator took control.
What would Sedessa eat if she could have a meal? And we thought something with wings would be ironic. And so this idea of setting that up subtly in the meal, showing her kind of eating a snack, and she's cutting it, and like, oh, what's this? Discussing her plans while she's cutting off a wing. This idea of symbolism where she's planning on doing that to Kyla.
On these shots, we used a couple different kinds of fluid simulations. On this one, you see this thick viscous fluid around the bird. And then on the ones with the wine glasses, we used a simpler simulation model because it was actually sloshing up out of the glasses.
You can see here how we reused components in the set designs as much as possible. The pictures on the wall are scans of our concept art. The clay maquette is just a model of Sedessa's bust with a different texture. And the windows and doorway have overexposed lighting with blooms, so we didn't need to design exteriors. So I guess the point here is that efficiency was always top of mind.
Kelly Ripa here with Curran's voice. She was wonderful. She did the most amazing Mommy Dearest impression in the booth. We were laughing for hours. Really, really nailed her lines, though.
We had a lot of creatures in this film that looked like plants almost, and plants that looked like creatures. It was something that really gave it an otherworldly feel.
We re-edited this sequence, recut it, changed it around 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times. The way you see it now is definitely not the way it originally was. There was a shot where they were walking straight at camera downstairs into the cave, and there was a big reveal in the cave. And in the end, we just cut right to the reveal and did the voiceover on the outside of the cave, and it works very successfly. The cheap flute bit you don't really get because you don't see in the film now. You don't see him in the market, because in the marketplace in the original cut of the film, he was actually trying to get a flute, and he traded an Uberstone rock for the flute. So here he says, makes his cheap flute joke, and it's just like, okay, plays it off, but there's no double meaning.
This scene Jason's mentioning here, where Delgo dupes a Norrin merchant into giving him his flute, is one of the deleted scenes on the DVD.
This idea of things floating and glowing in this kind of magical place, floating jellyfish, sparkling jellyfish, everything's kind of moving and glowing, and wanted to kind of create this kind of magical space for them to kind of have their first date. And then it kind of starts to go horribly wrong, where, he gives her back the brooch, and she's like, she remembers her mom, she gets upset, and then Delgo just pops. And, as is consistent with his character, we really wanted to show him being aggressive, overly aggressive and angry and just snapping, even at somebody he kind of cares about. And this was a scene we were really particularly worried, and it had to be delivered in such a way. So we spent a lot of time on making sure the emotion worked and played out okay.
And this cave they're in is full of these barrels of Uberstone because this is where they were actually mining it from.
It's just that he doesn't really understand me.
One of the other real interesting challenges was the lighting. We wanted to, again, there's so much moving in the scene, the gas from the Uberstones, the caustics from the water, the little floaty umbrella fish. There goes Delgo losing his temper. What are you supposed to be looking at? And so the movements really had to be, jarring and fast and draw your eye, and the cuts had to be quick and tight.
Yeah, Sedessa and your army. And what about now, Kyla? You think this is just ancient history?
So here again, Delgo shows his duality with a bipolar reaction to even the most benign statement from Kyla. This time he snaps, and he blames the woman he loves for the past. So it's evident that no matter what, he just can't let go of his personal history, and as long as it continues to plague him, he'll never really be able to live a normal life or become the Stone Sage he desires to be. Kyla's reaction is one of sadness, since she cares about Delgo so much that she's even violating the border law treaty just to see him. And although she realizes Delgo's comments are not directed at her personally, she's still hurt by his outburst and wants to get out of there before she breaks into tears.
These are some good shots to see how we had to have that subtle motion on all the background plants. So we actually wrote expressions that could create that motion procedurally through the way that we built the original trees and shrubs and such. And then in a following shot here, you can see a different technique on that grass where it was part of a procedural animation that was built into the program that created the grass. This little twirl is an example of another visual ad-lib that the animator was able to add in on their own.
I think one of the more unique aspects of the movie is our lighting and our texturing. This scene is a good example of the level of detail involved for each. With regards to the lighting, every shot had hundreds of individual lights, fill lights, bounce lights, key lights, ambient lights, rim lights, hair lights, eye lights, etc. All these lights were assigned to specific objects or layers. We also used saturated colors in our lighting to really make elements pop, often contrasting cool and warm tones to bring focus to items of significance. In this particular scene, you'll also notice the volumetric rays and extended shadows enhancing the intended mood.
We wrestled really a lot with the overall look and how we could create kind of a dreamlike space. And we ended up with trying to do this kind of light bloom where everything is a little overexposed, blown out, desaturated slightly. Some Green Army men there, little Toy Story tribute. We tried to kind of blow it out and get it kind of looking nice and soft and kind of spooky and dreamy. And then I was worried when this next bit happened that it would, the dreamy aspect would kind of soften it. But the horror in that kid's face, just the terror here, where we're hiding what's happening, but you're hearing it, I think was much worse. You know, it's always what you don't see, you know, that makes it worse. Old Alfred Hitchcock there.
This flashback incorporates two key lines from the film that haunt Delgo's memory, one being Sedessa's "Leave no survivors," which has already been revealed to audiences in the prologue as well as in the reflection in the Pool of Etok. And then the other is the "You're on your own, kid," which we try to mask both in audio and with the cinematography to not give away that it's Bogardus. And the ball here is the same ball from his childhood, which was shown in the dream. It's just a little reminder that his past is still with him.
This idea of blue light, problems with blue light, man. Blue light plagued us through this movie because you put blue, things in blue light and everything just goes completely flat, just desaturates. The shirt still is yellow, Delgo still is green, and so it was a real challenge for the art directors and the lighting team just to kind of get the colors right.
These cages were an interesting challenge too, because the animator not only has to worry about the character swinging around in this cage reacting to its motion, but then the character has to affect the cage, and then that effect that they place on the cage, of course, comes back and affects them.
Where is my daughter?
Here we use some Dutch tilts and some moving cameras, especially with this camera that pulls out at the end, just to give the feeling of disorientation that these characters have.
Ah, the Perrin spider. I always thought that was animated well. Funny enough story, that shot we gave to Eileen, and she's arachnophobic. She did a really good job, pulling probably from her own personal experience. Some of the softness of the film on the characters is a technique we call ambient occlusion, which creates kind of this soft darkening around the edges. Where two things meet, it gets darker, and as they pull away, they get brighter. And that really helped develop kind of a nice volumetric feel, I think, to the characters.
What did you do with the Princess, Lockney?
We didn't.
Not including the brief encounter when Bogardus attacks Delgo in the inciting incident. This is really the first time these characters meet. The idea is to show distrust for one another and also demonstrate their alpha male personalities. If these two weren't caged, they'd probably be going at it. So the irony here is that they're both fighting for Kyla's well-being, suspecting the other for her disappearance, when neither of them is really to blame.
It was white. What?
The razor wing. Are you sure it was white?
Thing nearly took my head off.
Rias.
This room was originally designed to resonate music throughout the isolated landmass of Perrin, where Sedessa is living in exile. The portals are for spreading her melancholy tunes to soothe the savage beasts within her realm. She has many different versions of this instrument called a Benderoth.
Just look at these flimsy wings.
Watch it.
Inferior to yours in all respectivities.
It's big.
Sedessa was actually one of the hardest characters to animate because she had such fluid movements and had to move with such confidence. And there was also quite a few areas where she had rather long monologues, so you always have that problem where you feel like as an animator you want to keep things alive and keep things moving. So this shot, we actually handed off to 2 or 3 different animators before we finally decided on a way to act it out and find that when we acted out naturally that we just really didn't use that many gestures. And once we removed all those extra gestures that we were trying to shoehorn in there, it sort of fell into place.
When we were doing the audio, the very last session with Jennifer Love Hewitt, I had her do some crying. And she started off with a sob and a sob and a sob, and it got a little more intense. And I was in the booth with her, and so she was just like full out crying. And, I'm sitting next to her, and I'm thinking, my God, I'm making this poor girl just tear up and cry, and I feel horrible. And I'm starting to tear up myself, and she sees me starting to freak out a little bit and tear up. And she's like, no, and she stops, just dead cold. No, Jason, it's fine. I'm okay. I'm just acting. And I was just like, wow.
This belt was an interesting rig because you wanted to have a natural secondary motion on it so that the primary motion of the hand causes this smooth serpentine motion down the belt, but then you also needed to control the end so that the animator could direct where they wanted to go. So we had to create this layered set of controls to get natural secondary automated over top of the primary controls.
Does your plan happen to have a part 2?
I'm working on it.
Lockney ingenuity at its finest.
This is great. I mean,
So here Philo is agitated as usual and overreacting to the situation at hand, yet he actually gives Delgo an idea of how they might be able to escape. But to do so, these 2 hotheads realize they're going to need each other, and they'll have to work together if they want to get their freedom.
Let's make a deal. I get you out of your cage, you fly us into the pit.
I'm submissive on Bogardus here. The camera's high up looking down on him, low up looking at Delgo. Delgo's in the seat of position of dominance here. Bogardus is in the position of, even though he's being argumentative, he knows he's wrong. So the camera is really trying to help direct the audience to kind of feel a little sorry for Bogardus and like make Delgo feel a little bit more authoritative, deliberately.
This is a good example of where you see the cages reacting to the characters even on subtle motions.
Those are porgu, we call those, little 4-winged crazy animals. We were trying to figure out, okay, what are we going to do story-wise here? How are we going to get Delgo over there? And, well, he's athletic. Let's have him jump. How about we swing the cages? So we had to come up, they had to actually rig the cages and set them up with joints and all the whole 9 yards. And this was a really interesting exercise because we had to actually think about the weight and how the weight was going to move the cage, and how do you test this? As the when you keep the chain stiff like that, it looks too stiff. So we actually had to subtly bend it here and there to kind of really make that pop.
Gotcha.
Sort of an amusing note here on this sequence. It's all about this ticking clock where you see the guard approaching and Delgo struggling to try to free himself. But when we were trying to sort of act this out for reference on how exactly it would work, we realized there's no way that this guy could hold himself up like this and then pull himself over. But the animator, despite his brush with reality, was able to fake it.
The whistling accentuates the casual nature of the guard. He's basically doing his rounds, which couldn't be any more routine, and then when the whistling stops, indicating this temporary confusion before he shrugs his shoulders and continues with his business. It's a good example of how a small element of sound can have a big impact on the story.
Your Majesty, we must act.
There's a beautiful bit coming up here. Angel Camacho came up with this, where we take one of those giant flying whales, the Futu, kind of blow right past this beautiful glass wall, and it adds just a little subtle element, just a touch of surreality, just to kind of push this fact that we're still in this alien space, just to remind you casually.
In developing the contrasting worlds of the 2 societies for the Norn and the Lockney, we really wanted to show how their cultures were so dissimilar. Here it's revealed how the political systems are so different, one being a monarchy and the other a democracy. Certainly there are design differences as well, with the Lockney wearing more earth tone colors based primarily on coarse fabrics and skins, while the Norn have more pastel attire with lighter fabrics better suited for flight. In fact, every primary character in the film was given a unique dominant color so they could be easily identifiable in a crowd or at a distance. So Delgo was yellow, Philo was orange, Rias red, Bogardus blue, the King was white, and Kylo was purple. The character recognition tested quite well. I'm not sure if the color distinction was helpful or not, but it certainly didn't hurt. The symbols on the chairs and banners in the Stone Sage Council chamber denote each of the 5 tribes. Delgo is a member of the Rani tribe, whose representative is the current leader of the council, Elder Marley. This key role is not by appointment, but by election, and the head of the council is not eligible to vote. So all council decisions are determined with these specially colored Uberstones where the voting is weighted. For example, 2 opposing votes don't just cancel each other out, since the intensity of the Stone Sage's opinion is also taken into consideration.
Same plan as you. Quiet, Philo.
This Yag tunnel sequence was one of the darker, more potentially frightening ones of the film, so we felt it was important to use Philo as a bit of a comedy relief to just lighten the overall mood of the sequence and just interject a little bit of humor throughout. These effects for the spider webs required a few different things, because here it's actually a piece of cloth he bumps into, and then as it wraps around him, you also layer a few hairs that are textured to be like spider webs, and then another piece of cloth there, and then a lot of hairs hanging off of him, and then some texture maps on his body to also look like he's wrapped up in spider webs.
While all this is going on, we needed to illustrate that the 2 races were preparing for war. These were some of the very first shots that we did in the entire film as we were cutting a trailer together.
We had this scuffle just because we wanted to really quickly reestablish this macho tension between the 2 characters. But then we were able to get out of it really quickly by having this total distraction, so that we didn't have to belabor the point. We just wanted to remind the audience about the state of their relationship.
When pushing in with a crash zoom to the baby Yag, it wasn't clear to some people that the Yag was indeed small. This is one of those cases where placing a known element of the mushrooms adjacent to the Yag can easily identify the scale.
The lighting here was a real challenge because you got this underlighting, which is green, and again, that fluorescent green or blue just kind of washes everything out. So Delgo's axe actually acts as the main light source in the film, but it moves. So it creates some really, dynamic and interesting shadows throughout the whole film, especially considering what happens because he's fighting with it. So we couldn't make it the only light source in the film, or in this particular sequence, and so we needed to kind of add kind of these extra lights every now and then, just kind of give it shape and form. But there's no special, even, concrete light source in the sequence. It's really just designed to make each shot look good. A lot of moving camera work here to create, a dynamic sense of action.
There was no solution right out of the box for this slimy, nasty goo we wanted, so I worked with Joe to get this stretchy, translucent stuff that just really looks like it would smell.
So we track up to reveal Delgo holding the Yag's baby, and by taking this action of taunting the ominous creature, Delgo is putting himself in harm's way in order to save Bogardus from an almost certain death. As Delgo runs off, his animation is so fluid, we're often asked if it was motion captured, but in fact the entire film was just hand animated.
In designing the Yag, we went through a few different revisions. We had one that was more like a giant worm that would tunnel its way through the ground, and then we had another one that was a little more intimidating that we actually ended up turning into a sculpture later in the film. But this one we wanted to be able to disable because we were planning on having its child used as a decoy. So in the end, we wanted them to be reunited, and you wanted to be able to feel like even though Delgo has disabled her by flipping her over temporarily, that she can still right herself. So we're just buying enough time for our heroes to get out of the scene and get away from it.
Is there one on me? Whoa! What? No! You're cool. Yeah.
While music drives the emotion of a scene, sound design is responsible for establishing the world. And unlike live-action movies, where ambient sounds are recorded when filming a scene, an animated film is essentially silent until the sound design team brings it to life. The wind rustling in the trees, the echoed footsteps of the soldiers, the melodic chirping of the Banty frogs, the majestic chime of the Uberstones, all of this and much, much more are created from scratch and timed to the visual elements on the screen, and then panned as appropriate to accommodate a particular location using surround sound techniques. The watchtower shown in the background here is actually the remnants of the structure seen on the hilltop earlier in the intercut scene with the gambling and the riot shots. Not that it's pertinent to the story, but the intent was to show some of the aftermath of the destruction caused by the Lockney vigilantes and give cause for the guards to be there.
John and the crowd team, way to go, guys. This was also one of the earlier shots. There's some Roger Dean kind of influenced architecture there for you.
Even though there wasn't a lot of cloth in this film, we ended up using cloth entirely for this hood on this Pookie character. It worked out really well, and even though it was cloth, it was still more economical to use cloth to simulate that than any other method. So it's just that one portion of his head is driven by a piece of cloth.
Take a look at this.
What is that thing?
I have no idea, but odds are it will lead us to Kyla. Let's go.
With this area outside of Sedessa's castle in Perrin, we wanted it to be really unappealing and just someplace you would never want to be, so we have these thick greenish clouds and this disgusting haze that just makes you not want to be there. And so our aesthetic kept driving us to say, oh, it needs to look better, but then you have to realize, no, it needs to look bad.
You'll note that the white wings are in a special glass case, and none of the others on her wall look anything like them. These white wings are essentially a replica of her real wings that she's been saving for 15 years to wear for her return to Jamora. She wants these wings to be the last thing her brother sees before she kills him and reclaims her destiny.
This whole bit coming up where we have kind of like a rock star approach to it, you know, Mark and I argued about it, or Gather and I argued about it back and forth a lot, and it was pretty funny because he was like, we got to have spotlights, you know, and we really want this, it's, you know, really got to show it up, and I was so against it, and I was so wrong, because it really makes it, you know, she really is, you know, a pop star, and that's how she wants to be seen, and you know, the great Sedessa, here she is, and bam, all the lights go out. It's like at your rock concert, bam, right there. It's like, where are those spotlights? They don't have electricity, you know, but it's believable. You buy it, it works. You know, the smoke rolling off the stage. It was a really great idea, and I'm really glad we did it. The Queen wave. Yes.
Behold the Norin's most valuable
So
treasure.
the Ondo crowds, this whole idea of Engineer Prondo here is, I mean, we needed to up the stakes a little bit in how she was gonna cut, you know, get her wings cut off. Or were they gonna use a sword, or was it gonna be sawed off, or whatever? We wanted it to feel kind of gruesome and rusty, kind of Civil War like, you know. And I remember Jackson and I talking about the design of what would Prondo's toolkit look like, and like, oh, it's got to have one of those nasty Civil War leg saws in it, you know.
Create a distraction.
Sedessa's speech actually continues here in the background, although you can't really make out what she's saying in the mix, and that's a very good thing. We didn't have anything written for these lines since we assumed it wouldn't be on camera and covered by other sounds, but when we realized it was needed at the last moment, I wrote some lines that were so ridiculous that Anne stopped reading them mid-sentence, looks up at me and said, "Are you kidding?"
For years, we have suffered on this barren rock.
This sequence had a lot of shots of Sedessa that were quite long and drawn out, so it was one of those situations where we really had to economize her gestures. The tendency is to overact and try to fit too much in, so we would do first and second pass, and it just wouldn't be right. It wasn't feeling natural for her character, and so we ended up sitting down with the animator, discussing it, and then acting it out and shooting still photographs of the key poses only, not even the motions in between, and then they pretty much nailed it first try.
My citizens, my children.
Most of the crowd cheering is actually 5 recordings of someone chanting, Sedessa, Sedessa, Sedessa. It's overlapping and it's modulated enough that it's not too repetitive, but if you heard this track just by itself, it's rather humorous.
This is another one of those reflection shots where it just would never really line up the way you wanted. The animator would animate to a different camera, and then, lo and behold, you would render the real reflection, and it just wouldn't look as good. So we just render it from the animator's camera and map it on.
From this day forward, we will no longer live as outcasts.
And the whole Candy bit with him kind of comes and goes. This idea of Philo and Candy. It came out as a device to allow us to be able to give him a way to actually cause problems.
This is just one of those many cases in production where I think I ended up making that gumball just because everybody was busy. We had an idea, and I just had a few minutes to do it. All kind of little things like that when you do a full production.
We have a quick moment of tension here as Delgo is cornered and barely misses Voltak's blow, accentuated with this camera shake. The following dexterous moves of Delgo, jumping from buttress to buttress, is meant to parallel his actions earlier when he hops amid the backs of these stampeding rockbiters.
Delgo?
At your service.
This was a really interesting bit to choreograph too, because it's such a tight space for the animators to work in, and we had to really think about the moves to make sure that everything would go according to plan.
Throughout this entire act, there's so much action that there wasn't a lot of time for Delgo and Kyla to really share a screen and have a moment, so we were able to get a moment for them to have a little interaction here and even have a little reinforcement of their romance right before everything really breaks loose.
Here again you can see Sedessa's eye sickle symbol on the base of her stage. This representation was inscribed to remind the troops of her infinite power, since she ruled by fear and aggression.
The look of a lot of these effects evolved over the duration of the project, so the shield that comes off the end of Delgo's axe is based on the Uberstone effect that was developed by the FX guys earlier in the film.
Here comes that yag. The second yag right there. The thing that the big Ondo guy's holding, that's the tooth of the former yag that we kind of posed and reused the model just because it was creepy looking. You can see a better shot of it there, just to again add some interest to the outside sculpture, give Delgo something to crawl on.
This is really just a quick beat to lighten things a bit and transition to our intercut parallel action chase scene. First we'll have this gag with an audio cue, and then we have a gag involving more physical comedy. These Ondo are packing boxes for the trip to Jamora, where they plan to live after Sedessa's conquest there.
We massaged this sequence a lot in the layout process because there was so much intercutting between what's happening with Kyla and what's happening with Delgo back on Perrin.
The contraption of Prondo's flying machine was one of several devices we designed for him, but the only one that really made the final cut of the film. He was originally a recurring character with a mad scientist-type personality who always constructed these ridiculous mechanisms for Sedessa to wear functional wings, enabling flight, but all of the experiments would ultimately fail in some comical manner. In shortening the film, we just gave him this flying cart, which was like a clown car at the circus, defying the laws of physics with seemingly endless amounts of components that came out of it.
Each time we cut back to this chase scene between Kyla and Prando, we are really increasing the tempo. In this case, she actually pulls off a maneuver to evade Prando, which was relating back to a scene that got cut, which is now in the extra features. It was just a setup so that when you came here, you could see her doing that same sort of maneuver. In this shot, Delgo has this heavy breathing, and we actually had to add some functionality to his facial rig in the middle of production just because we never foresaw him having to breathe quite like that, and it was really the only shot in the film where he did. This was a first for the animator because typically you don't even see shadows. In this case, the shadow is the only thing that mattered, so we had to develop a system so that they could see what it was going to look like before we went and did the actual render.
The previs on this sequence was really tough because we had to have all these spheres in the scene to be able to kind of gauge where we were going to put rocks, so that when we sat down and looked at the camera direction, that it actually made sense. And we ended up shaving a lot out of it, which I think was good because it was way too long before.
As the film progresses, you can see Delgo has to start relying more on his Stone Sage powers rather than just his brash youth. So you can see it starts out sort of slowly, and in this case, it's almost comical because he doesn't really have a full control of his powers yet. He has enough to confuse and impress these Ondo imps and brutes, but when he gets a little too excited about it, then he actually loses control, and you can see that he still has a ways to grow, even though you can see he has such great potential.
That stuff in the back for Delgo, the backpack on Delgo, was constantly getting in the way. Right there, it's going through the tail of the Zuzu.
Pronto's cart presented a few big challenges. First of all, he's got all these different implements that can move in and out of it, and with the way the 3D space works, there's certain things you can't fake. Those arms have to go inside of the space, and they have to be able to move in and out of it freely. So we had to make controls for that and actually make things collapse and scale in such a way that it was going to actually fit inside the physical space that was created. Most of the time, these characters weren't even actually moving through these asteroid fields. They were just moving in place, and then we would move the asteroids behind them. And sometimes we would actually move them faster or slower just to get the effect we wanted so that it worked with a particular part of the sequence. We wanted Pronto's exit here to be slightly funny, so we actually used a little squash and stretch and cheated reality to have that cartoony hang in the air right before he falls. One of the things we ran into a few times, especially with really wide shots like this one going off into the distance, was that even if they were in true 3D perspective, sometimes it just didn't look right, so we'd actually go through and just fudge some of the layers to make them look more natural.
Mark really wanted, Adler really wanted to create this kind of in-between space between Perrin, which is where Sedessa was exiled, which is that green, and Jamora, which is more the blue sky and the happy thing, and his idea was to have them pass through this kind of stormy area, and I think it really worked. It was kind of this yellow purpley, in between area, and the lightning and the flashes in the clouds and all of that really kind of make for a mid-ground or a Midgard type of feel.
In conceiving the Uberstone, we needed to define the rules which governed its power, and in essence, Uberstones can only be activated by a Stone Sage and may take one of three primary states. Either kinetic motion, where the trajectory can be controlled without touch, an energy field projecting the shield with a limited circumference, or a radiant blast, where the stone would implode, releasing an expanding but diminishing force. In these battle scenes, you'll see a bit of each of these Uberstone states. It was critical for the Lockney to have this capability to literally level the battlefield with the Norn, since the Norn have the advantage of flight.
On this sequence, we really wanted to get that juxtaposition of the huge characters in the background, but then getting that sense of scale when you just see this gigantic head of this carrier coming into the foreground.
From a distance, Sedessa strokes the castle she's longed to rule. Then we cut to it, where Kyla has already returned and discovers Gelmore's ulterior motives. Here again, we've repurposed elements, borrowing set pieces from other scenes, creating tapestries from production art by adding a bas relief weave pattern, and placing objects on the table like our topography map of colonies used for staging.
I cannot permit that. Your Highness, it is not safe to leave the palace. Raius will undoubtedly be looking for you.
Of course. Gilmore, you're
We had some animators that were just great at the cartoony stuff, and anytime we had some scene where we could explore that, they would just jump right to it.
I never said anything about riots.
You'll notice that we tried to lighten many of the beats of violence in the film. Here we do it with some comedic moments of Anoran slapping himself, but in other shots we'll make the Ondo less menacing with some goofy, mentally challenged actions, or with Prondo agitated by his malfunctioning flying machine.
For this crowd scene, we really used the wide aspect to just make it feel like these Ondo were just pouring over the hills. This sequence was a lot of fun for the animators. It was obviously there to show Delgo's progress back to Gamora, but the animators were able to stretch their legs and just enjoy doing some punch-drunk animation. Throughout the escalation of this war scene, we start out with a lot of charts and diagrams to track the pacing, from the Lockney winning to the Norn winning to the Ondo coming in. But in the end, we had to take all that information and we combined a lot of the different chunks that we had done into something that flowed better and made it a lot more exciting to watch.
So here was a dilemma. Do we have to show how the Ondo get to the king, or do we just let him go? Do we have to actually show it or not? And we just chose to kind of do little small intercuts to kind of speed up the action here so we can get to the important parts of the film.
I was really happy with how well several different animators were able to keep Sedessa so consistently graceful and in control and just almost frightening with her fluidity. From this point till the end of the film, the king is actually bound, and he's in a lot of shots, so that was a challenge to make sure that the animators could still get enough expressiveness out of his face and just body language with that limited mobility he has. This was one of the first sequences that we animated that actually had dialogue, because these two characters were two of the first to be cast, so I think this sequence shows the care that they took once the animators were able to dig themselves into a scene that had real acting, and of course with all the drama and monologuing you had here, it was a perfect place to do it and get a good start.
Experiencing the sweet taste of victory. The Norrin people will thank me and welcome Sedessa as their true...
I thought the POV shots here really emphasized the character's position of power. When Bogey confronts Rias, you'll note how casual he reacts. This attitude is apparent in all his animation, in contrast to Bogardus's impulsive and wild gesturing. Philo's animation style in the background is consistent with his personality, snappy and exaggerated, and this murmur line here was pulled from a comment made from Catan between line reads.
This is one of the sequences where we just had a lot of fun with the rapid fire choreography, and one issue we always had was trying to examine the motion of what this kind of stuff would look like, because obviously we didn't record jumping off of somebody's head onto a nose of a giant flying beast, so we would just use examples like springboard divers and different Olympic events and just try to do a little bit of that with our own safe acting on the ground.
This is my favorite scene in the film. Very Hong Kong-y for me. Love this shot. Old West, the build-up, the blowing wind, blowing hair, how poised and debonair Rias is compared to the ferocity of Bogardus. And just, he's so calm, he's so collected, and he's just coming in at him.
You can see we used a lot of really wild and creative camera moves and angles on this as well, because we weren't tied down by limitations since the entire fight was taking place in the air.
How do you do a sword fight in the air? What kind of moves would they make? Would they do spins? Because do they want to protect their wings? How would you choreograph it? And it was tough.
The fight continues here, with Rias obviously having the upper hand. Now Bogardus is completely disarmed, as he has a blade to his throat, much like Rias when Bogardus was sent to jail and incapacitated the guards. So that scene was a setup for the payoff here, as the tables are turned, and Bogey uses the same maneuver to do in Rias. Many of the sets like this one have the horizon line obstructed by seemingly endless repeated objects. This contributes to an epic feeling while actually cheating a bit to cover up for this edge of the world look where it's sometimes hard to suspend disbelief that what's on the screen is an alternate reality because there's not sufficient detail in the distance.
Delgo, look out!
This shot with the brute running away always cracks me up because he just looks like such a coward. He's almost childlike.
It's Bogardus' sacrifice that finally makes Delgo realize that we're equals. We can't hate each other anymore. He has this flashback then right here to his childhood by hearing the same voice, and he understands now that this is the second time Bogardus has spared his life.
This is the end of Act 2, where in a 3-act structure, the stakes are highest for the protagonist, and yet he is also at his lowest point emotionally. Thus, the king has been captured, Bogardus is dead, Sedessa has taken the castle, and Delgo's people are at war with both the Norn and the Ondo. This all leads us to our Act 3 resolution, where Delgo must make a choice to define his character and culminate his arc by matriculating into the Stone Sage he was meant to be.
We really exaggerated the walks on those guys in the distance, and they sort of have a funny strut if you look close. I thought this was a great reunion between Sedessa and the king because it was in the room you saw them at the beginning of the film, but despite the king's defiance, she's clearly in control and enjoying it now.
Don't be silly. She's family.
In these sequences, the king is bound. You see his hands are tied behind his back, but we had to decide what to do with those wings because they had to be somehow bound as well, but if you bind them up, they are visually in the way all the time, so we came up with this tucking under the arms trick and just invented it on the fly.
Then we have one moving camera right here because she's ascending the throne, so the moving camera is really accenting her rise to power over the king, the domination.
Despite our constraints, we still had a lot of stuff that just had to always move, a lot of secondary motion, so the wings, the feathers on the back of the king's suit, even the flap on the front of his suit and their hair, it always had to be moving a little bit to give it life, so we had to rely on a lot of secondary scripts that we created to just keep those things moving along with the bodies. For these huge crowd scenes, we would animate little pairs of high-quality fight loops and then use them as pods to populate throughout with some in-house software that our team wrote so that we could populate the entire field and make it look random.
Delgo, stop!
Delgo's frustration causes him to have this emotional outburst, which is where Kyla has to get through to him and help him understand it's at stake for both of them. She shows her support and her love and impresses upon him that the only means of survival is for them to work together and for their people to work together. Delgo is initially confused and defeated, but he becomes determined and resolute after Kyla's pep talk.
I need you.
What can I do? They're running all over us.
This notion of Delgo getting an idea, this inspiration from this visual cue, was a direction we wanted to go, just so that we didn't have it too obvious or too straightforward for the audience, but not so obtuse that they wouldn't recognize it.
I'm gonna need your help too.
Hopefully the relevance of the white razorwing is apparent here. It's a rare albino razorwing originally owned by Bogardus and lost to Rias in a bet. So when the Ondo sees a white razorwing approaching, he naturally assumes it's Rias. Delgo's plan to approach the castle without conflict on this white razorwing was conceived when looking at Bogey's ivory lucky charm.
Get him!
Here we wanted just a concise sequence that would show Kyla turning a corner and taking the role that she, up to this point, hadn't quite been confident enough to take. This sequence was just a lot of fun from a fighting choreography standpoint. I mean, it was still difficult having this tiny guy fighting this huge beast, but there were a couple fun things like, actually knocking his helmet off gave us the ability to have Vaultek be a little bit more expressive with his ears and facial expressions. And that nose ring, oh, that thing still hurts me when you see that hammer being yanked. But when laying out the scenes, we put the basic motion on the camera, but then the animator on shots like this does all the fine tuning so that you really get that handheld tracking feel as the animation's polished.
Delgo inadvertently angers Voltak here when the statue is shattered, which is the last thing he wants to do to this ferocious beast. But then he discovers a means by which he can use his speed and cunning to eliminate his opponent by positioning him in harm's way and breaking another chain from this statue.
For this effect, the animator actually animated in slow motion, and it just seemed to work better than trying to animate in full motion and then slow it down on the computer. And then afterwards, they have to use a lot of their imagination and some basic previs tools to understand how this final product's going to look, because when they're working on it, they don't have any of the lighting effects or the Uberstone effects to help them visualize what it's going to really look like in the end.
Now Delgo realizes that not only did his plan fail, but the impact of the massive statue had absolutely no effect. At this point, Delgo is left to resort to, well, hitting below the belt, and is soon left to be defenseless.
Now, all of a sudden, this axe that used to be Delgo's father's is gone. And it's broken into pieces like we saw in the Marley blend together in the Stone Sage Sanctuary.
In these shots, we really wanted Sedessa to seem not only smug, but actually honestly entertained by what a complete failure Delgo's rescue attempt was. This was another sequence that was originally a bit longer, and we cut some shots out, but you can still see one of the interesting things, which was the communication you have to get between a character who talks and obviously a nonverbal creature. These form dissolves are always difficult because you want to have them sort of perfect since it's in CG, but I think they're definitely worth it.
With our limited resources, we had to work very hard, but we also had to be smart. The film needed to be designed, shot, and told in a way where we could cut corners where they wouldn't show. In essence, regardless of our limitations, it was imperative to have the full emotional impact from an audience without sacrificing quality. You'll notice here, and in a lot of other sequences, how we confine our space in most circumstances, but we give just enough of a hint at the scope with a single shot or two to maintain the illusion of the epic scale without blowing our budget.
When we first planned this scene with the Pookie relieving himself, I was pretty concerned, but then I saw some other children fare where they had that, and then the kids laughed, so I'm glad we left it in. The animator who worked on these Pookie shots actually studied video of his own dog because he wanted to translate that personality and liveliness of his own pet into the animal on screen so that Sedessa would really feel like she connected, and hopefully the audience would as well in the end. Some of the animators would record themselves acting out a scene before they started animating, and this was a really amusing one to see because the reference footage had him reacting to this stone that of course was not there at all, but it translated really well into a realistic motion.
There are lots of little inside jokes in the sets by virtue of the Lochni and Norn text on the various objects. Since we created a language for both societies based on a 36-character alphanumeric code, we would often add a little texture, excuse the pun, to the background elements in the scene. So for example, the first banner to catch fire in here has an ex-girlfriend's name on it. I guess it's best for me to remain silent on other instances that may have a hidden meaning.
Between the destruction from the braking column and the smoke and fire damage, we had to create the feeling that this building could really collapse at any moment. For all the things you try to plan for in the film, one major goof we realized near the end production was that we had a lot of characters in the sequence with a fire, and so we needed to create these soot-covered, cut-up, bruised versions of the textures, and several people, myself included, actually had to help with that texturing because we just kept realizing more and more characters that were in this.
This piece was from the original prologue, one of the very original prologues.
We used it because we really felt it set up the decision here where Delgo really had to make a hard choice to go back and actually try to help Sedessa despite all that she'd done in her life to wrong him. It just shows that depth that he has as a character.
At this point in the film, Delgo's arc is finally complete, and he's now a Stone Sage. He's displayed his control over the Uber Stones by merging them as his mentor taught him. He's risked his life to save the king who jailed him. He's let go of his vengeance to save Sedessa from falling into oblivion. And he's defeated Sedessa's muscle, General Voltak, using his skill and cunning. And that's why we decided that it was Kyla who was the one who must vanquish Sedessa, because the tension between those two characters was much stronger and more personal. Kyla's cries as a baby foiled Sedessa's plans to seize the throne, which ultimately led to her exile, and conversely, Sedessa is responsible for murdering Kyla's mother and almost chopping off her wings. So we wanted the confrontation between these two to end with satisfaction for Kyla, but not really a defeat by her own hands, since having blood on her hands would be contrary to the underlying message of the film. Thus, Sedessa's demise here is somewhat incidental, yet it's still fulfilling for both the audience and the other characters in the scene.
We saved a few epic scale shots for the very end here so that the audience could get the feeling that everyone is coming together in the end finally. And then we made that more personal and intimate when you come into the close shots and you get to see Delgo reunited with Marley, and then you see the king come in as well and make his peace, so you see that they've moved beyond their troubles. Rice's return at the end here was to show this sort of last bastion of Norn, who still were bent on keeping these races apart, but I think it's really punctuated when they're saved here, and Rice is actually wrestled to the ground by one of the Norn soldiers that he used to command.
After being maligned by Philo yet again, this time by the broken spear landing in their nest, the Geps have finally had enough, so they unite and retaliate. Like many of the creatures in the film, they are shown to be intelligent creatures with a personality. We close the film with the obligatory kiss, as these two have been stopped short of a smooch both in the cave by the Squeep and at Sedessa's castle when interrupted by the Ondo. The Uberstones that were surrounding them was a visual embodiment of the hand and the heart being one at last.
I hope you've enjoyed the commentary.
This is Warren Grubbs signing off.
And this is Mark Adler. Thank you for listening.
That will be all for today. Please evaporate the hall in an honorary fashion.